here. All right, so one second. Just in time. Yeah, barely, Marquise. Barely. All right, where's that cursor? Okay, so what did we learn last time?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. We learned about human computer interactions. There's different types of interaction styles for different needs. Like if you want to do like a survey or something, you would use a Q&A open-ended type format or fill in form format, or for something like VR or AR or anything, using more than just your eyes or your mouth, but your whole body movement. You would use 3D navigation. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the type of interface we have with a computer is going to be largely dictated by kind of the task at hand. So you mentioned some of them, filling out the form. You can have 3D navigation in various environments. That's good. What else did we learn? HCI is design, hardware, and software. Yes, yeah. So you have not only that software, right? When we think about HCI, frequently we only think about the software aspect, right? So the user experience, the aspects of kind of the interaction with the system. But frequently, it also is going to include the actual physical hardware of the system. So things like the mouse or the keyboard or things like that also are included. Great. What else?
Computers are supposed to be polite.
Yes. Yeah, computers are supposed to be polite, right? It sounds absurd that people would give a crap about what their computer asks them or tells them to do, but you want it to be polite, much in the same way that we expect interactions with other people to be polite. And so these are pictures I took last year, back before COVID, and I left them in because it helped remind me that eventually we'll all be able to travel again. But I went to, I think this was when I went to a wedding last year, and two different things stood out to me. The first thing you see on the left was in my hotel for my sink, and you can see how close they put the faucet to the edge there, right? Now, why is that an issue? Well, it's an issue because I can't get my hands in under that water in the actual bowl of the sink to wash my hands without slamming my hands into the actual bowl of that sink. And if I wash them above, I'm now splattering water all over the counter there. And so while they thought it looked sleek and nice, it's actually tremendously inconvenient. And then you see on the right-hand side, this is at the Denver International Airport. The sign here says Air Cargo, General Aviation, Fox, and Terminal/Pena Boulevard. And you can guess that the Terminal and Pena Boulevard is probably to the left, and you can guess probably that Air Cargo and General Aviation is straight, but there's not much clarity about which way you go for Fox rental cars, which was uniquely frustrating because I was actually using Fox rental cars. And so having to try to interpret this sign as giving some sort of direction and indication about which way to go made it a little bit of a pain in the tuchus to navigate that area. So it doesn't really have anything to do with HCI, but I thought I would leave those in because this time last year I was ranting about them, so I figured I would keep them in there. Questions about what we learned last time or about class so far? I just realized I wasn't showing my camera. Apologies. All right. If no questions, today we are talking about trust in not trust in automation, but human automation interaction. But first, here's your fun fact of the day. Scotland apparently decided to buck the trend and pretend like unicorns are real, and therefore you have the national animal of Scotland as the unicorn. Lord knows why. All right. I'm not going to show this video, but I think this is kind of a nice example of kind of some of the issues in a very comedic way with automating things that don't necessarily need to be automated, right? So that's going to be the undertone of a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, both the human automation interaction, but also the fact that there's a propensity to automate a lot of crap that doesn't really need to be automated, and we will have some of that discussion moving forward. So first, let's define automation, right? We talk about automation a lot colloquially. We talk about it even in the political sphere as of late with things like UBI, right? That's become a major talking point. But when we talk about automation, all we're going to mean is that a machine, usually a computer in this case, although it doesn't have to be a computer, is performing a task that otherwise is performed by a person or that has never been performed before, right? All it's saying is a machine, frequently these days a computer, is doing something. All right, we tend to think about automation as being some sort of kind of cutting edge technology with self-driving cars, with autopilot and airplanes, things like that. But in reality, a lot of what you use in your day-to-day basis is automated. So things like a dishwasher is automated. Things like your printer, cruise control in your vehicle, even if it isn't an adaptive cruise control. Elevators are automated. Phone lines are automated, right? You no longer have somebody sitting there waiting to take your call and plugging in the cord accordingly. So the question comes about of why should we automate in a lot of these capacities? Well, one of the biggest reasons is that you have impossible or hazardous conditions for performing a task, right? Handling of hazardous materials, radioactive materials is a good example. Right? Bomb disposal robots being used downrange or overseas is a good example of why you would want to automate something. Take the human out of that risky environment. But there are also cases wherein a human just can't perform a task. Right? Think about somebody who is a quadriplegic. An electric wheelchair now gives them a higher degree of their own personal autonomy through the automation of the movement of that wheelchair. We also want to automate the difficult or unpleasant things, right? There's a whole book out there called Automate the Boring Stuff, I think is what it's called. And it's with Python as a programming language. But this is one of the bigger ideas, right? That we just want to automate things that are either difficult for humans to do or just generally unpleasant for them to do, right? So things like assembly lines. When you think about assembly lines, it's a very repetitive action. And for our grandparents' generation, it was typically the case that somebody would get a job on an assembly line and work there until they retired. But it leads to low job satisfaction. That's one of the things we'll talk about in coming lectures. Calculators, right? The benefit of calculators is now that we don't really have to perform any of these calculations ourselves. That may be slightly different in the engineering college, but teaching statistics here in the psychology department, people freak out if I don't allow them to use calculators for a lot of these things, right? And so we have automated a lot of this calculation process through the use of something like calculators. Obviously, also extending human capabilities, right? And so enhancing the individual, enhancing the human with memory and planning aids, or automating tasks to help with multitasking, right? Because nobody can really multitask. You can task switch, but if you can offload one of those tasks to a computer, you're in a much better position. And then a lot of people will automate because it's just technically possible, right? So things like phone menus, right? Press 1 for Andrew Ratchley. Press 2 for Spanish. I don't know why those are your only two options in this hypothetical case, but that's all you get, Andrew or Spanish. And so when we talk about automation, it helps to contextualize different stages of automation, right? And these stages, if you've taken cognition, you've likely seen this in some regard. It may look familiar as the human information processing model. And we just use this similarly for automated systems, right? And so we have 4 different stages: information acquisition or selection, filtering, information integration, so this would be kind of the perception aspect for human cognition, action selection and choice, and then control and action execution. Right, and so you see examples down here of automation in each one of these domains, right? So spell checkers, I don't know why that went away. So spell checkers are a good example of information acquisition, right? Picking up that information and providing it to the user. Information integration, so it's pattern recognizers, predictor displays. So this information integration would be where things like computer vision come in, right? Being able to detect that something is a dog or a cat. Action selection be things like traffic alert and collision avoidance systems in your vehicle, right? They're making the action selection choice. And then the actual control or execution of that action would be things like that adaptive cruise control, etc. Trading algorithms and whatnot. Right, and the trading algorithms is a really interesting example because so much of trading these days is completely automated, such that these companies aren't really making decisions. They're writing algorithms to make decisions for them. And you'll get a case every so often. I don't remember what year this was, but there was a flash crash in which the stock market lost something like 10% of its value in a couple seconds, because these algorithms were building off of each other, responding to each other's actions, and crashed the stock market there shortly. The stock market had to pause to reset these algorithms and essentially just wiped out the losses of that day. But when we talk about automation, think about what of these 4 stages are we automating? But there are also levels of automation, right? So it's not just what are we automating, what stage are we automating, but to what degree are we automating it? And there are different levels of automation depending on environment, right? So the Society of Automotive Engineers has a 6-level classification of automation in vehicles. But this tends to be kind of the best generalized level framework. So you can see it ranges all the way from low or level 1, where the computer offers no assistance. Human makes all decisions and all actions, ranges all the way up to full automation. And when something is fully automated, level 10, we call that autonomous. You'll hear a lot of people, even in the scientific literature, use autonomy and automation interchangeably. But they're very different concepts, right? Something can be automated without being autonomous, right? You as an individual, without getting into the whole Cartesian dualism arguments, are autonomous. You operate on your own. You have no need for input from others to act. An autonomous vehicle requires no input from the user, no supervisory control from the user to perform its actions. You can even see at a high level of automation, there still may be a case where the computer decides to ask for your input. Hey, should I go left or right here? Hey, does it look like that bicyclist is going to come into our lane, etc. And so you can combine these stages and these levels into a single framework we're going to call degrees of automation. Right? So you can see that for any individual system, the 4 different stages can each have their own varying levels of automation. Right? So you can start painting a little bit more of a nuanced picture for every individual automated system, what that actually looks like. Right? You can think about systems that have perhaps very low information acquisition, moderately high information analysis, but then they do nothing with that information. Right? That type of system looks very different than a system that has no information acquisition, no information analysis, no decision selection, but carries out actions it's told to carry out. Questions about any of this so far? Cool. All right. So colloquially, we like to talk about automation as the be-all, end-all, right? That once we automate things, everything's going to get better for everybody. But in reality, there are a lot of problems with automation, and we're going to talk about each one of these in turn here. But things like the automation's reliability. So a lot of automated systems are less than perfect, right? And that reliability is going to matter, especially in high-risk domains. You get cognitive constructs like trust. And so trust and automation is really what I focus on. Kind of a tag onto that would be things like overtrust, complacency, what we call Utluf, or out-of-the-loop unfamiliarity, individuals' workload and situation awareness, mode confusion, loss of human cooperation, job satisfaction, as well as training and certification. So we're going to talk each one of these in turn here. So first thing is reliability. And so reliability is how essentially predictable and dependable is a certain system. One of the issues with a lot of automated systems is that they may just be unreliable. You may not be able to predict when it's going to fail. Or you may have a lot of cases of false alarms with warning systems, right? And this is one of the cases, when we talk about the actual display and development of alarm systems, one of the biggest problems is alarm systems that get so annoying, people just turn them off, right? In my vehicle, I've got the lane deviation warnings, but they're pretty conservative. The minute I hit that line, that lane deviation warning goes off. And it's gotten so annoying, I've just turned it off. The performance is also going to vary in certain situations. So again, a lot of my research up to this point has used a Tesla, and Tesla is very good in some circumstances and awful in other circumstances. Right? Tesla does not do well if the road turns and it loses the lane lines. It just hands over control back to the human without any sort of forewarning. Also, because it's inherently reliant on just computer vision rather than LiDAR, it'll frequently miss big red objects, which is just an artifact of the way computer vision is done currently. But it's really good at stop and go traffic, right? So you start to learn these certain circumstances under which it's good. Oh, there's somebody. Okay. You also have Kate. Oh, hello.
Sorry. Yeah. I had a quick question about the Tesla example.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So you had mentioned that, or I think this is the second time you mentioned that one of the issues is that if the Tesla's computer system, the task is overwhelming for them, they would immediately transition the controls back to the driver. Do you know what's being done, I guess, currently to make that transition a little more seamless, so it's not a unexpected occurrence for the driver?
Unless Tesla is doing something covertly, which I don't know why they would be doing that. They're not doing anything. And so this is actually one of my biggest beefs. Don't get me wrong. Far be it for me to tell Elon how to do anything. He is far more brilliant and far more wealthy than I ever will be. But he was pressed on this by a researcher who does a lot of this autonomous driving stuff at MIT named Lex Friedman, has his own podcast. And on the podcast, he asked Elon, why don't we have some sort of driver monitoring, right? So that way, if you're going to hand over control to the driver, we can at least verify that the driver's awake and paying attention, right? And Elon said it's moot. We're so close to fully self-driving cars, we don't even have to worry about it. And that was over a year ago, and we're nowhere close to fully self-driving cars. And so, there are a lot of kind of safety defaults you could, in theory, engineer into the system, right, of turning on the hazards and just slowing down the vehicle. But yeah, it is a really jarring experience, and frankly, I think a really irresponsible design choice on Tesla's behalf, and I love Teslas. But that they essentially just say, nope, we can't do it, and they hand over control immediately to the operator. Good question. So you can also have this sort of incorrect setup of automation, right? And so one of the things we've talked about already is kind of these defaults or no kind of safety catches, wherein if a nurse enters an extra 0 on the amount of drugs to give a patient, if there's not an appropriate setup, the system's going to say, okay, maybe you did mean 10 grams of whatever, morphine or fentanyl, things like that. And one of the biggest issues with human automation interaction is the lack of what we call transparency, right? And so when I say transparency, I don't mean like the physical ability to look through a system, but it's that same sort of conceptual understanding of, I have to understand what the system is doing, what it sees, etc. Especially as I'm building trust, right? Think about when you were being taught how to drive, your parents likely sat in the car and frequently said, hey, look over there, pedestrian on the corner, cars slowing down, etc., right? Because they wanted to communicate to you or make sure that they knew what you were seeing, how you were interpreting the environment. And when a system doesn't have that ability to say, hey, this is what I see, or this is why I made that decision, people tend to have really kind of negative reactions to it. It's okay if the system screws up, but the system has to tell you what went wrong. And this gets into the concept of trust, right? So trust is this cognitive construct that we're going to just kind of generally say is characterized by the reliance on a system in a situation characterized by vulnerability or risk. And for the longest time, when we were making these sort of automated systems, we were saying, how can we increase trust? We need to increase trust in the system. As we'll talk about in just a minute, that's not always the right answer. And so the response has been, actually, we don't want trust to be high. We want trust to be calibrated. If the system is trustworthy, if it warrants high trust, then we should have high trust. But if the system sucks, we shouldn't be over-trusting it. And we'll talk about some of those issues in just a couple of slides here. And that trust can and should be situationally dependent, right? I came to develop really good trust, or really high trust rather, in the system, in the Tesla, in stop-and-go traffic. So much so that on my commutes, when we first got the Tesla and we were trying to explore it and whatnot, I just wouldn't even pay attention to the road. I would put it in self-driving mode and just let it take me until I knew I got to a certain area where traffic let up. But I would also know that Teslas were notoriously bad at seeing stop traffic on an interstate. And so I would take back control from there. So having too low of trust is what we call distrust, right? You may hear this classification that you should have trust, but not mistrust, which would be the over-reliance or over-trust, or distrust, which is too low of trust. And that can be a function of false alarms, poor transparency, etc., right? So poor reliability can lead to problems with trust. All right, so give me 1 second here. I'm going to try and get this video up because I think it would be all right. So the single greatest scene in television is this subsequent one, and then we will talk about it. Zoomies, you can hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
cool.
Proceed straight.
Well, we're 0 for 6. Last chance is the Elmhurst Country Club, other side of the lake on the southeast side.
I don't get it. I really don't get it. I thought this would work. Threw everything I had at that guy, nothing.
That's how it goes sometimes, you know? You lose everything, and everything falls apart, and eventually you die and no one remembers you.
That is a very good point, Dwight.
Make a right turn.
Wait, no. It means bear right.
No,
Up there.
It said right. It said take a right.
No, look. It means go up to the right, bear right, over the bridge, and hook up with 307.
Make a right
Maybe it's
turn.
a shortcut, Dwight. It said go to the right.
It can't mean that. There's a lake there.
I think it knows where it is going.
This is the
the
lake.
machine knows.
This is the lake.
Stop yelling at me.
No, it's
Stop yelling.
There's no road here. Remain calm. I have trained for this. Okay. Exit the window. Here we go.
Make a U-turn, if possible.
Look out for Leighton! Michael! Are you okay? Swim for it! I got you! Michael! Let go! Let go of Michael! Come on! I got you! Michael, come on! Come on!
So I know you're saying, okay, that's a funny example, but it's just kind of a comedic one at that. And that couldn't happen, surely, right? Go to Google and type "guy follows GPS into a lake" and see all the examples of people doing exactly that, right? It's insane, but people will completely overtrust systems just because they're an automated technology. Give me a second to transition back here. All right. You can hear me again? Can you hear me again? Can you hear me again?
Oh no, there's an echo.
Yeah.
I think I just answered my own question by accidentally forgetting to turn off my speakers. Perfect. All right. Back to this. So again, we don't want to maximize trust in a system. We want to calibrate trust, right? You want to make sure that systems you are developing are as reliable as they can be, but that you're not engendering trust in a system that is unwarranted by that system. Yeah, there we go. So again, when we talk about trust, we want to make sure that because overtrust has consequences, we're not reliant on a system that we shouldn't be reliant on, right? And so overtrust, again, is just signifying that you have too much trust in a system for its actual capabilities, right? This can lead to what we call complacency. And so complacency, in the case of a self-driving car, would be you trust that Tesla to navigate the environment, and it can't do so. All right, and so one of the early published cases of overtrust with self-driving cars was a case of a man named Josh Brown down in Florida. He was an early adopter of this technology and was driving on the interstate and was reportedly either watching Harry Potter or reading Harry Potter. I can never remember which one it was. While the car was driving itself, a big rig pulled out in front of the car. So his Tesla was driving down the road. A big rig pulled out to go this way, and his vehicle couldn't tell the difference between the big rig and the sky around it. He wound up crashing into the big rig and dying thereafter. Right? So this is one of those issues, right? Marquise, when you brought up the example of, okay, well, what is Tesla trying to do to deal with these cases where the vehicle just hands over control? This is one of the reasons it's such a big problem. So even when the vehicle's not handing over control, you're still supposed to be paying attention and being vigilant, because these systems are far from perfect at this point. They're getting very good, but in very controlled settings, in environments that are very kind of predictable, even in their unpredictability. And so we need to make sure that you don't have this kind of over-reliance on a system that you shouldn't be reliant on. One of the other problems is OOTLOOF, right? So this out-of-the-loop unfamiliarity. And this is the function of essentially skill degradation because of automation. Right, so that out-of-the-loop unfamiliarity can also mean, poor detection when using the automation. So you don't see the kid chasing the ball out into the street when you're using that self-driving vehicle. That poor situation awareness. Remember that third level, that third stage of situation awareness is the ability to project into the future, right? And so being able to take back control from that vehicle and know that it's likely the case that the car that's coming up the on-ramp, faster than you're driving, is probably going to try to overtake you. And then you also have the issue of skill loss, right? So if you, for a long enough time, rely on an airplane to fly itself, when it comes time for you to take over controls, you're not going to have sufficient skill levels to actually fly. All right, questions about what we've covered so far?
I have one.
Yeah.
So have they done any, I guess, studies on how effectively people can take back control from an automated vehicle? Like, I knew if I was going to get in a wreck and it said, take over now, I would probably be freaked out and not be able to drive.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is a big line of study for the last several decades as it was becoming more evident that we were going to get to a position kind of where we're at right now. And the findings are pretty disturbing, right? There was a researcher by the name of Neville Stanton, somewhere over in Europe. I can't remember where he is, but that looked at exactly this. What happens when a car just spontaneously says, nope, it's yours now? How long does it take them to return to baseline driving performance? And this one study suggested that it takes between about 30 and 40 seconds for you to get back to baseline performance of driving, right? I mean, think about how far you've just traveled if you're going 60 miles an hour over 30 seconds, right? Just 8 football fields over that course of time. And so, yeah, I mean, it is a really big issue. And that's one of the things that kind of angers me that the field isn't taking more seriously, because this is not a new concept, but it absolutely is a potentially devastating issue. Good question. Other questions? Right, and so this is I think this actually serves to highlight one of the issues with human factors, right? You'll get a company like Tesla who will say, for the last 4 years, Elon has been saying full autonomy by the end of this year or by the end of next year. And here we are 4 years plus without really that in sight. And the companies don't want to invest into some sort of driver monitoring system, because I think in part that acknowledges defeat, right? To some degree, they've said, oh, well, okay, we're not actually that close, so let's revamp this. And they also just don't see the utility, right? So their solution has just been to tell the person to pay attention at all times. That's obviously not going to happen, right? You also tell people not to text and drive, and they do that, right? So thinking about what are these fail-safes we can engineer into the solution to prevent any sort of these catastrophic situations.
I'm sorry. I guess I'm kind of naive, but I would think that if, a company like Tesla, I guess, or at least the CEO, kind of shoes off a potential life-threatening risk of a car, that at least outside of public backlash, there will be some type of financial, like, I don't know, if their stock price goes down or something to push them to implement, a safety measure to ensure that the driver is awake or alert to take over the controls. So yeah. When he mentioned that, when he mentioned his answer, as well as the fact that I guess they haven't seen the need to do that, I kind of find that shocking, because I would think that they would be forced to do so, whether by public opinion or financial reasons.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And this is one of the battles that Tesla is fighting literally in the courts every day, of people saying Tesla's responsible for lulling us into this kind of sense of security, and Tesla's saying, we told you to pay attention the whole time, right? And you'll also see, after each one of these accidents, go read the news reports from them. And there will usually be some sort of indication that the driver wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing, paying attention, right? And so one of the things they've done is kind of offloaded the responsibility to the human user, right? But when we've talked about things, these designs up to this point, you have to remember that people are not only going to use your system as it's intended, but also try to use it in ways that it wasn't intended for, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more here. But Marquise, I mean, you raised on a really good point of, you know, what are the ethics of a certain situation versus, and it may be that Elon truly believes every year we're just a year away from full autonomy. But I think asking any expert in the field, of which I've had the pleasure to interact with a bunch, nobody says we're that close, right? This may be a completely unsolvable problem to get to a fully autonomous car, because driving is a lot harder than we think about. And so thinking about what are these kind of trade-offs between the safety and the risk. Now, it is true that in general, Teslas are safer than human drivers, right? That about 40% reduction, according to NHTSA. But you do still have these problems that are like, you know, you want to go and bash your head against the wall and say, we could have told you this was coming 30 years ago. And why aren't we addressing them now? Yeah, if one of y'all remind me, I'll send out that link to that podcast where he says it's moot. It really is a shocking, it kind of shocked me when I heard it, So we also have issues with workload and situation awareness, right? Good automation is going to reduce workload. Right? It takes away what you have to do. But clumsy automation, automation that's not well implemented, will reduce workload on easy tasks, but actually increase workload on harder tasks. But you also get the situation wherein, because we have automated part of the process, we now say, okay, well, you can do more because we've automated part of your job. The problem is, what happens when that automation fails? Right? So let's say you're a drone operator and you're responsible for monitoring, 5 big Predator drones up in the sky, right? These Reaper drones were the ones that the US military used to use. I don't think they use them anymore. Let's just say you're using one person to supervise the flight and the overall orientation of each one of these drones towards its stated goals. And you're not actually having to fly them. You're just having to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then all of a sudden you have a full system crash, a server crash, right? And so now you have to fly each one of these drones physically. Imagine the nightmare associated with that, right? That's a very physical workload. But you can imagine a kind of analogous situation wherein you have a similar crash of systems that now takes high mental workload to actually get to the point where you can maintain safe operation. And because of this, we kind of redline, right? So this is what we're talking about when we say redlining, wherein the amount of available resources you have is a finite capacity, right? Just like in attentional resources. Excuse me. What happens when I'm now demanding more of you than you can physically perform? Right? So you can now see the performance just beyond this kind of redlining area drops off precipitously, right? It's not a one-to-one increase, a 1 unit increase in workload beyond that corresponds to a greater than 1 unit decrease in the performance on all of those tasks. Right, and so this is the issue when we talk about driving and talking on the phone. Again, we've already talked about the attentional resources and whatnot, but you are substantially worse at having a conversation on the phone when you're driving, and you're substantially worse at driving than you're having a conversation on the phone. And that diminishment of performance on those two, when combined, is greater than the sum of its parts. You also have issues with mode confusion. All right, so mode confusion, a good example of this is you're typing away and don't realize you've hit your caps lock and have just sent a text message to somebody that's in all caps, and it looks like you're streaming at them, right? But again, you have these issues, and I'm going to keep going back to self-driving because that's what I know best, but I'm happy to extrapolate to other examples if y'all want to talk about those. But with this automation disengagement, right? If the alert and the warning isn't attention getting enough, right? It's not adhering to these good C principles that we've talked about. You're gonna have people who think they are in self-driving mode when the vehicles actually said, no, we're no longer in self-driving mode. And you have the similar issue with the actual engagement, right? So in Tesla vehicles, you have to pull the stick towards you twice to engage that auto driving. And I've ridden in the car with people who thought that they had pulled it twice and engaged the auto driving and take their feet off the brakes, hands off the wheel, and just start looking around before we all realized that, oh, I actually hadn't put it into self-driving mode, right? And so there's this mode confusion wherein they're assuming they're in one mode and in reality, they're in a different mode. So one of the things that's kind of the most interesting with our approach to automation is that we've removed one of the greatest sources of communication that humans have with one another, right? So much of our communication is nonverbal communication, right? Somebody's tone of voice, somebody's posture, their eye gaze, right? You can tell when somebody has a 1,000-yard stare. Right? So even if I don't know each one of y'all all that well, am still able to pick up on kind of universals that give me some sort of indication about your state, whether you're listening to me, what you see, etc. And with automation, we lose a whole bunch of this, right? So an automated system, we're not really getting all that good of an indication unless it's got great transparency about what that system sees, but what that system is planning to do, but what that system feels. Right? So we've tried to start mimicking some of this. You know, when we start getting into the talk about robotics, the line gets a little blurry between what's automation, what's robotics, but the actual physical embodiment of a lot of these automated systems has led to some really creepy examples, right? So this is what we know as the uncanny valley. It's called the uncanny valley because as human likeness increases, our fondness or our liking of the system increases until we get to a certain point, right? At a certain point, it looks human-like enough, but there's something off about it that just seems creepy. Right? This is that example you have right down here. It just looks creepy, right? It's obviously more human-like than now up here, which is that robot. But it's off in just certain ways that are really unsettling. At which point, we have a substantial decrease in fondness or liking of it. Then he says, the uncanny valley could be the location of a horror movie. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you go and see a lot of these systems that, I mean, it is an incredibly difficult task to get a system that not only looks like a human, but also has facial movements like a human. And there are a lot of companies that are making great strides in it, but holy crap, are some of the byproducts creepy. Which then leads to kind of hybrids like you get with Sophia that has a very obvious artificial back of the head, like it looks like a computer, and then a human-like face, right? So they're trying to find that right balance.
I do have a question, Nathan.
Yeah.
Are you a proponent of I know part of the uncanny valley theory is that the reason we as humans don't like it is because it reminds us of our own mortality. I always thought that was interesting, where I don't know if that's what's going on behind the scenes, or if it's just creepy because it's kind of close to human but doesn't look like human. But I always found it interesting that it's related to the feeling of mortality and being aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar, Denny says that one of the kind of post facto explanations for this is that sometimes these kind of look like dead bodies, right? So they are human-like, but they're missing the animacy, they're missing kind of the life behind the eyes, things like that. And I like that explanation a lot. A lot of these explanations are kind of, post facto, fit the peg into the hole in whatever way we can. But I do think that there's something to that of why are we so turned off by things that look very much like us but aren't identical to us, right? And that could be because historically, just through the evolutionary process, it's representative of something wrong with that other person, right? They're either dead or they have some sort of disease or infection, things like that. And so, yeah, exactly, like zombies. And so I suspect there is some sort of component of that, whether it's reminding us of our own mortality, or if it's a function of, we just have this evolutionary drive to get away from things that may be sources of contagion. But yeah, it's an interesting idea. And so getting into the actual job sector, right? So when we automate a lot of things, we frequently talk about automation as kind of a replacement for the human operator. And one of the things we'll talk about in a few lectures are what are the predicates for actual job satisfaction? Right? What are the things that lead to people being satisfied with their job? And some of that includes things like honing your skills, right? Feeling like you're developing as a worker, as a person. We tend not to like jobs that are just repetitive and mundane. We tend to get a lot of satisfaction out of feeling like we're developing a skill or a habit, or not a habit, excuse me, a trait. Just supervising automation can be profoundly boring, right? If you're just sitting there staring at a screen waiting for something to screw up, that's going to be very unsatisfying and boring, etc. And this will often lead to disuse of automation, right? I would rather have a higher workload and get something done, feel like I'm doing something, than just watching a system perform tasks. And so the whole issue up to this point kind of leads to a natural debate. It's known as the function allocation debate, right? What should we automate? And what should we have humans do? And this led to Fitts' list. Now, it's obviously been updated since then, but it's still kind of good to have this historical contextualization. And it's also sometimes called HABA MABA, right? Humans are better at, machines are better at. And so in this approach, we're giving tasks to the machines that they can do better than we can, right? Humans are much better calculators. Did I say humans or machines? Machines are much better calculators than are humans. But there are a lot of aspects of being a human that we're much better at, right? It takes stupid amounts of data to train up some sort of visual classification thing, right? I don't have to present you that many pictures of what a dachshund looks like, a dog, for you to be able to tell me that's a dachshund when I show it to you. Machines, on the other hand, you have to present a crap ton of data to get them trained up on just that simple classification. Right? And then you can also leave the human there to deal with the failures of that automation. Right? When the system screws up, have the human there ready to take back control. And so here's kind of a more updated list and fits list. And so when I say fits list, it's also the same guy that came up with Fitts Law, just FYI. So you can see things that humans are better at, that machines would be better at. And I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can see kind of an example here across the spectrum of what may be good for humans to do in any environment. And so this suggests that it's not always the answer to just go ahead and automate everything away. Right? If it's a task that automation or machines are actually in fact better at, and that would open up the human to performing some sort of secondary task, great. But don't just as a default automate away everything. But again, it's not just as simple as this Habba-Mabba approach. You know, think back to those earlier issues, right? We got to keep the human in the loop rather than just waiting for failures, right? What happens when a system fails if a human doesn't have good situation awareness about that environment, about that task? And the problem beyond that is that a lot of domain-specific tasks are very interconnected, right? So vessel tracking, right, or boat tracking or aircraft tracking may be best for the computer, but the decision of where to go based on that information may be best for the human. Right? Think about all of the nonverbal cues we use when approaching somebody, right? We can tell if they recognize us, if they want to talk to us by their body posture and them slowing down, where they're going to go, if they're going to break left or they're going to break right. Right? And it's hard to separate these entirely, right? So it's got to be that interaction between the human and the system.
I have a question or a comment.
Yeah.
Going back to that Tesla, the guy in Florida, where it seems like if Tesla used, or if they at least had, the GPS information was available, say we had it in every car or all of our cell phones, and they could see and had an algorithm to, you know, detect the probability of, say, that tractor trailer truck coming into the pathway of that Tesla within, say, even 30 or 45 seconds earlier, to where it could send a notice saying, hey, you're entering a high traffic area, or you're entering, you know, that could have prevented that, where even if he was reading Harry Potter, it would let him know many seconds before. Obviously, I don't think they'll go with that, but you know, something like that. I think that's maybe an example of what a machine could do better with all of that data. It would confuse us, but it could tell us where we might run into issues.
Yeah, well, you're illustrating kind of a very clever solution that a lot of people have started relying on. And this is the idea of V to V communication, or vehicle to vehicle communication, right? And so the idea is that one vehicle can communicate to another, hey, I'm coming up on this traffic light, slow down because I have the right of way, etc. And it's a really kind of compelling idea, in part because, you know, you avoid potential issues of misperception of systems like that. But the problem is you've now introduced a second failure point, right? So whereas in the Tesla as it is currently, you have a single failure point wherein the vehicle is reliant on its sensors And if it fails to sense something, something goes wrong. In the V2V communication style, you don't have 2 points of failure, right? You can have a failure in direction, in that first direction, or you can have a failure in that second direction, right? And so one vehicle says to the other, hey, I'm coming, and this vehicle doesn't perceive it. That's an issue. Or perhaps this vehicle never says, hey, I'm coming down the road, and that presents another issue. And so, you know, I'm a big proponent of kind of the redundancy in this case, and so I think that would be a great approach. And so you're starting to see kind of an abandonment of pure V2V communication and a hybrid of this vehicle to vehicle, but also this sensor integration, because you're exactly right. If there was some sort of redundancy for, you know, the Tesla to say, I don't see anything, but all of a sudden I'm getting this indication that there's a big rig coming my way, and they're slowing down as if to turn, maybe I need to be a little bit more vigilant or alert the driver. So yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting way in which we're starting to kind of discuss keeping that human in the loop in some capacity, but having fail-safe or redundant measures. So.
Yeah, and it seems like that it might increase the false positives, but in the case of a system failure like that, maybe both cars, you know, stop or slow down, and so you end up with the driver like, I don't know why my car is stopping, but it prevents the accident from happening altogether. So it's a false positive, but because of the system redundancy there, it ends up saving lives.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting example. And again, kind of in a human factors domain, I think if money's no object, it makes sense to have all the redundancy in the world. And now the problem is just convincing these self-driving cars. And look, I'm picking on Tesla, but it's not Tesla's problem alone. It's every self-driving vehicle manufacturer right now. So, but it's tough to convince them that, hey, you need to spend an extra $1,000 on this equipment that we have to standardize across all these vehicles, when perhaps the competitors aren't doing it. So unless that comes down from kind of the federal government, it seems unlikely that that type of solution would be implemented.
Right.
But,
it's like a seatbelt or an airbag. It's like it has to be standard. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's a really interesting idea. But all right. So again, you also have attentional principles. Right? So when automation fails, you need that failure notification to be early, attention grabbing, and be able to fall back on the fail safe if the human can't take over, right? We've already talked about this with the Tesla. It'll give you a warning, and it's actually a fairly jarring warning. It does a good job of attracting attention, but there's no fail safe there, right? The vehicle just, it's like you were to, you know, take your foot off your gas on your regular car, and it just goes wherever the wheels pull it. I want to be cognizant of time here. So yeah, we've already talked about this kind of transparency aspect. So wherein you are designing these systems, you want them to be transparent, right? So the individual, the human, can understand what that system is going to be doing. It perceives the intentionality of that system, needs to know what's going on. That transparency can help with the situation awareness and the trust aspects. However, there's always a trade-off, right? With more transparency comes more clutter and thus a higher workload. So you got to find that right / happy medium or balance. So for the response selection principles, obviously you want to avoid accidental activation and deactivation, right? You don't want to put the controls in such a place that I can easily bump that automation stick and now I'm kicked out of the self-driving mode. So you want to make it obvious when a system is activated and make it just as obvious when it's deactivated, right? And so you want some sort of redundant system, right? You can present a little chime, but you want some sort of redundant display so I can look down and engage with that system to know what state that system is actually in. So little over a year ago, I went out to Reno, Nevada, and rented what was it? I can't remember off the top of my head. Ford Fiesta, there it is. And so one of the issues I had with it was it wouldn't tell me when I had engaged cruise control, and it wouldn't tell me when I had disengaged cruise control. It would just give me an indication when I had set the cruise control, right? So a lot of these vehicles you have to turn on cruise control, and then you set cruise control, and then you can turn it off. But the only indication it gave me was when I set the cruise control, right? And so I didn't know that I had turned it on or off and couldn't figure out how to actually turn on that cruise control. So for interaction, obviously keep the human in the loop. We have this whole principle of the lumberjack analogy, right? So the higher the tree, the harder it falls. The higher the level of automation, the bigger the consequence is when that automation fails. As automation increases, situation awareness goes down, which obviously creates a problem for when the automation fails. You want to do everything you can to support smooth re-entry into that loop, right? And so attract attention at the right time, attract attention to the right things, provide information that would be useful and beneficial. And then allow people to change the behavior of automation without disengaging it, right? So if I want my self-driving car to have a higher limit of how fast it will go, don't make me disengage the automation, take back control from it to then try and re-engage it in a different capacity. Allow for those minute adjustments. I already talked about that. And then, where possible, and this gets to be a little bit more complex, but try and consider what's known as an adaptive automation, right? So a system that can change as needed. So think about a human teammate who says, oh, you look like you got a lot on your plate here. Let me just take that off and I will perform this task for you, right? Have a system that can do that. That isn't just a binary on or off, that it can adapt to the needs of the user, right? And so we have this desirable difficulty range. We don't want to be completely underworked. We don't want to be overworked. We want to be right in that bread and butter zone, sweet spot. And so have a system that can do that. And then finally, anytime you have these automated systems, you're going to want to keep people trained, right? So you want to train for both the management of the system, but also when to intervene, right? How to detect that the system has screwed up and when you should take back control from that system. How to recover from a failure of that automation. And then also how to actually perform that manual task, right? So let's say we have no more automation. How do you perform that manual task? So you can go back to thinking about math, right? Being able to do long division by hand isn't necessary when you've got the calculator, but when your calculator battery dies on your exam and you can't do long division, you're in a bad position. So making sure you still maintain those manual skills. And then consider the organizational consequences, right? We talk about automation frequently as replacing the humans, but should we also talk about it in terms of kind of enhancing the human? And so this is one of the big pushes in the military now to not come across as if AI and robotics and automation are going to be replacing the warfighter. They're going to be enhancing the effectiveness of the warfighter there. Right? And we can have a whole conversation getting to the policy decisions associated with automation, right? And whether or not this time's different, right? You always hear that about, is this type of automation, sounds like Skynet. Yes. Yeah. So, the question of, is something about this automation revolution going to be different than automation revolutions in the past? And I would definitively say it is, because now we're automating cognition in a way we haven't done before, rather than just automating those later stages of action selection and action implementation. We're now automating the processes of information acquisition and the perception, which lead into those later stages of automation. All right, so next time we have a guest lecture from a girl I went to grad school with, Alex Vienna, who is doing UX research at Facebook in their AI department. She's asked if you have questions ahead of time. She's going to answer questions after. But if you have questions ahead of time, to send them to her. And what I've done is put a Google Drive or a Google Sheets, Google Doc link in the announcements page on Canvas, so you can upload questions there so she can try to answer them during the actual lecture itself. And then also be mindful that she's going to only answer questions that are relevant to the UX of AI. And so no questions about anything related to the election or to Facebook's policy, stuff like that. We want to be mindful and appreciative of the fact that Facebook's in a tough position, kind of regardless of where you fall on a political spectrum, and there are a lot of hot button topics. And so she's only going to answer questions pertaining to kind of AI, UX, stuff like that. So this shouldn't be an issue. I just wanted to make sure nobody came with guns blazing asking about Facebook's policies on X, Y, and Z. So questions about what we covered today? Who's going to go out and buy a Tesla now? You are? I don't blame you. I would too. I think there are a lot of really bad design decisions. But what's that?
Maybe in a year when it's fully automated.
Yeah, you shut up. Never going to happen. It may happen, but not in a year, that's for sure. All right. So Boeing team, go ahead and stick on back so we can chat real quick. And then otherwise, we'll see you on Tuesday for Alex's guest lecture.